Happy Tuesday, everybody. Today we're going to be doing the community deck techs and probably the last bit of community deck techs until we get foundations sometime in November. So I'll let you guys know by posting again in the community tab when we're going to go back to them. So when we do this, I pick 4 at random. And so first up here, we've got Shane S93. With a Selesnya Artifacts deck, and it's always fun to see a resubmission, so we can kind of see how the deck has changed since the last time we did the community deck tech. And so we've got, I like the direction that it's going in, right? I think that it's definitely improved, and I think they mentioned that they hit Mythic with it, and it looks like a pretty solid list. Now, one thing is, first thing I like to do is talk about the lands. So we've got 24 lands, and you mentioned potentially playing this in best of 3. I think I would be on 25 if you're going to play the Plantoon Dispenser. And if you're going to get rid of the Plantoon Dispenser, then I think I can agree with 24 in best of 3. Now, one of the issues that I have with this deck is that you have a split between you needing turn 1 white mana with Novice Inspector and turn 1 green mana with Teething Wormlet. And I noticed you have 4 of the Hushwood, the Hushwood Verge land. And so on turn 1, this is going to be a green source, but not a white. So just keep that in mind that right now, I think if you count it, not including the Mirrex, you have 11 untapped sources of white on turn 1. And I would like 14 to be able to cast the Novice Inspector 90% of the time. And so I would try to tweak the lands a little bit to get those untapped white sources up there, because you are running, some tap lands as well. So just something to consider. You might want to bring in more plains and bring down the forests to kind of hit those numbers. So just a suggestion. And the other thing that I'd like to do is just kind of talk about the cards that are not usually included in the Selesnya Artifacts archetype. So I have seen this deck growing in popularity. I think the Nerdy Steve did one just like a week ago, who's a content creator on Twitch that I really enjoy. And I also saw a 5-0 standard league by, I didn't write down their name, but anyway, seeing more attention being drawn towards the Selesnya Artifacts archetype. So the people that I was looking at who were exploring it, they weren't including the Elvish Archivist. This one usually being included more for the enchantment build than it is for the artifacts build. And same with the Thousand Moon Smithy. This one not usually being included, although it fits the theme of the deck. Same with the Archivist. And then Platoon Dispenser is one that I haven't seen in a lot, and I think part of it is because it is so far up the curve, right? Now, you are bringing in the Porcelain Gallery and the Dollmaker's Shop, which would be another reason to try to increase the number of lands and go to 25 lands instead of 24, and keep the Platoon Dispenser in. It does give you a nice mid-range threat, but it's answerable to like an Abrade, and then you're way down in mana, right? So it depends on how much artifact hate you're coming up against. And we do see a couple of cards that are usually included in this archetype that aren't in the list. So just for your consideration and a refresher, I think I mentioned some of these before. Warden of the Inner Sky is usually included as a 4 of, and Sir Ginger, the Mealender, included in as a 1 of, and Kellen, Daring Traveler, included as a 1 of as well, and has some synergies with the archetype. So if you wanted to, you could drop the Platoon Dispenser and run the Sir Ginger and the Kellen, and you would be more like the typical Selesnya Artifacts deck that I see. Not necessarily better, though, just something for consideration. I see a lot of people running 4 of the Regal Bunnycorn as well, and this one fits nicely if you are going to run the 4 copies of the Novice Inspector. I notice you've got it down to 3 here. And then also the Unidentified Hovership. And I didn't actually include that one in the sideboard. I missed that one, so I apologize. But it's the vehicle that we got in Duskmourn that is able to exile something and then can be crewed and attack in as a 2/2 flyer. Is a particularly nice artifact to include, and triggers your Teething Wormlet, has nice synergies, and gives you a little bit of removal. And then it's not going to get wiped out by the board wipes, which this deck is weak against. And you already have bumped into the Aven Interrupter, which I really like to see, because this is kind of the archetype's answer to the temporary lockdowns and the Sunfalls. So the last thing that I'd like to talk about real quick is the you mentioned wanting to try to build a best of 3 sideboard, and I would take a different approach to this deck a little bit. So I'd probably run the Aven Interrupters in the sideboard, and then bring them in on the matches where you are facing like a Sunfall. And so my suggested sideboard for you would be to bring in 2 Tail Swipes, 3 Anointed Peacekeepers. This is another way to kind of get rid of the Wraths, Temporary Lockdown, and Sunfall in your opponent's hand. I would bring in 3 Aven Interrupters in the side, and then 2 Archangel Elspeth. And this one works well enough for the kind of... It gives you another thing that's kind of resistant to Wraths, right? Because the Planeswalkers don't get hit by the Temporary Lockdowns and the Sunfalls. So this would also be something that would be kind of, with the Aven Interrupters, Anointed Peacekeepers, and Archangel Elspeth, you could kind of sideboard into that if you were coming up against a lot of board sweepers, if that makes sense. Sheltered by Ghosts, I think, is strong enough too, especially because like you are getting some enchantment synergies, and like this card is just kind of really, really strong, especially if they aren't running cheap interaction that's able to shoot your target. So I would definitely consider having 2 Sheltered by Ghosts in the sideboard. I noticed you have 4 copies of Get Lost in the main. I'd probably only be running 3 and then have the 4th one in the sideboard, so that, you could bring it in against the matchups where it's really advantageous. Get Lost is one that kind of is matchup dependent. It depends on how well they're going to be able to use those 2 map tokens. Like the Caretaker's Talent and the Boros Tokens deck really punishes you for using Get Lost, for example, right? And there are others as well where the value off of the map tokens actually does matter. So consider maybe not running the Get Losts. Elspeth Smite, you could run in best of 3. You're going to come up against Gruul aggro and mono red aggro, maybe a little bit less, and you do already have some single point interaction for those archetypes. So not necessarily needed to be included, but you could, instead of the Tail Swipes, run Elspeth Smite. The upside to that would be a all white sideboard, so that you could make white a more majority color, which would help with like the double pip on the Aven Interrupter. And then let's see. Also, I would finish it up with 2 split ups, and this one you could also run the Temporary Lockdown. Again, it depends on if you're running it in best of 3, you're less likely to come up against Boros Auras. And I've really liked the split up as a kind of Temporary Lockdown-esque kind of card to explore. So I'd be bringing those in for the go wide matchups. So hope that finds you well. Hope that gives you some ideas, and thank you for your submission. All right, the other person to win the random die roll was Visual D16, and this one is also a Selesnya deck, and also one that we've done before. So another resubmission, and I like the way that you went with this. I see that you got rid of the Bristly Bill. You mentioned you brought up the lands to 22, so I would run this at 21 lands in best of 3, and 20 in best of 1, and that's with an asterisk that you get rid of the tap lands. So you're running the Valgavoth's Lair and the Restless Prairie, and I think this list was at 22. So if you're going to keep the tap lands, then you're probably good at 22, but you could get lower if you want to get rid of the tap lands. Same thing as the deck before by Shane S93. You're running 11 untapped white on turn 1, at least by the way that I counted it. And so again, you want 14, especially because you are torn as well about whether or not to play the Optimistic Scavenger or the Pop Hatch Recruit, and especially because you're trying to set up a Sheltered by Ghosts on turn 2, you don't want to stumble on your turn 1, right? So I think it's very important to get those untapped lands, and would recommend moving away from the tap lands. I get that they give you a little bit of value, but I don't think they're necessary for kind of inhibiting getting the Sheltered by Ghosts down quickly. Now, As far as cards not usually included, this is more of a Selesnya Counters take, and instead of strictly like a Selesnya Auras take. And so we've got the Pop Hatch Recruit instead of like a ward creature. We've got the Reluctant Role Model, which I really like with the counter synergies in this deck, and considered for the Sharpshooter for a second, but I think I like the Reluctant Role Model more. And then Ozolith to lean into the counter synergies, as well as the Botanical Brawler. So what I want to ask is, I believe this deck was intended for best of one, and if your strongest play in the deck, I think, right? I don't know, I haven't played this deck, but I would imagine that the strongest one is playing Sheltered by Ghosts and being able to copy it with Calyx, right? And with that, my question is the counter synergy actually stronger than ensuring a good target for the Sheltered by Ghosts, right? So your typical like Selesnya Auras deck, right, would be running the Toadstool Admirer and the Tamaqul Honor Guard as a way to have ward to protect your target for the Sheltered by Ghosts. And then you could also run a Royal Treatment to further protect with the Shard Mage's Rescue to kind of lean into Green's really great ability of protecting the Sheltered by Ghosts target from single point interaction. If you're not going to go in that route, which I'm not saying you need to, right? I'm just saying something to consider is it better than some of the alternatives that we're seeing, right? I think that if you keep it the same and you go for the counters, I'd like to see Skrelv in here. I think that some way to be able to push a creature through as well as kind of give you that protection from the single point interaction would be nice, if you're not going to go with the Royal Treatment. Now, the other card that I think would be helpful, similar to the previous deck, I think this deck is going to struggle with Temporary Lockdowns and Sunfalls. And so I think Invasion of Gobakon makes a lot of sense, especially because you're doing the counter synergy. So if you're going to just run it as Selesnya Auras, don't bring in the Invasion of Gobakon. But if you're going to care about the +1/+1 counters, then Light Shield Array leans into that strategy really well. And then it doesn't protect you from Sunfall, but it protects you from Deadly Cover Up in black, right? So it gives you some Wrath protection, and could be worth exploring. For one of the cards that you're playing, that one's up to you about what you would take out, right? So I hope that gives you some ideas, and thank you for the submission. All right, third up on the list is Boros Tokens by Reality Uncovered, and they said they hit Mythic with this list. I believe it. Looks like a pretty solid Boros Tokens strategy to me. So one thing I did notice was that you were running a 23 land count, and at the very minimum, I would be running this at 24 lands in best of 3. I guess I can see it maybe in best of 1, where you kind of like your 1, 2, 3 is going to be a little bit smoothed by the hidden mulligan that they have, or whatever, the hand smoothing. So personally, and I think the stats show this too, is that Boros Tokens plays as a control deck that really doesn't want to miss its land drops. So the average deck has 26 lands, and part of that is because of being able to, like, the hidden costs of your cards. This deck does better flooding than it does getting screwed on mana, right? So if you like get stuck on 3, it can be kind of detrimental, especially in the mirror match. Now, so I would probably try to figure out how to get like 3 more lands in here. And I know everybody wants to cut lands, and sometimes I don't agree with it. So we do see a couple of inclusions that we don't usually see, at least in best of 1. So one of them is Destroy Evil. Not to say it's a bad inclusion, just for other people who may not be familiar with the archetype. Enduring Courage is another one that I don't usually see in this archetype, but I do like it here, especially in combination with Season of Burrow, being able to create 3/1 haste rabbit creature tokens. Like there's some cool synergies with the Enduring Courage that I'm really sold on. The Fear of Missing Out, I'm a little bit less sold on. It does help you kind of smooth your early draws and can kind of justify going to a lower land count, but not enough for me to be completely sold on the lower land count. But I can see kind of the logic behind it. The other one too is the Mondrak and Glory Dominus, and this one just leaning more into the token synergy. I've found Mondrak to be a little bit more like win more, where the times where you don't have the tokens, you're in trouble, and then like the additional tokens aren't insanely impressive in my mind. So I'd probably be on like getting rid of the Destroy Evil and the Mondrak or the Fear of Missing Out to get those additional lands in. But I do like to see the innovation that you brought, so thank you. And to just cover really quickly with some alternatives that are typically included in the archetype, usually we see 2 to 4 temporary lockdowns, and this helps up against Boros Auras. And I think this was a best of 1 list since it didn't have a sideboard. So temporary lockdown kind of helps up against at least a match that I bump into quite often. And 2 copies of Abrade can give you some artifact hate. Depends on how much you're coming up against the mirror match where you have other Urabrask's Forge. But we typically see that one as a possibility, maybe over the Destroy Evil. Up to you. We also see 2 to 4 Brotherhood's End, and that's usually instead of the temporary lockdowns. And there's some pros and cons to it. Being able to destroy the artifacts with mana value 3 or less helps against the Urabrask's Forge, makes it less necessary to run the Abrades, right? So could consider the Brotherhood's End. The downside is, of course, the double pip red is harder to do, but you're already bringing in the double pip red for the Enduring Courage. And we also have the two Elspeth Smite is a pretty common inclusion in this archetype to help up against the mono red and Rakdos aggro that we're not seeing as much Rakdos aggro, but against the aggro archetypes, Elspeth Smite's pretty nice. And you do have Torch the Tower, Lightning Helix, Get Lost, so you have a lot of interaction. But the exile on Elspeth Smite, some people like to run it. And then 1 to 3 copies of the Virtue of Loyalty is pretty common as a way to kind of an alternative win condition. Definitely not necessary to include, but at least worth a mention, right? Also, Beza, the Bounding Spring, 1 to 2 copies, can give you kind of a mid-range stabilization against aggro, and has token synergies with the archetype. And we're also seeing 2 to 4 copies of the Dollmaker's Shop as another way to lean into the token synergies of the deck. And 3, Kutzel's Flanker, if you're coming up against a lot of Azorius Oculus, this one giving you some nice graveyard hate as a way to kind of bring it in as an option. So you weren't necessarily looking for a way to improve upon this deck because you did hit Mythic with it, and it's always one of those that I always feel a little nervous about when talking about how to improve a deck, because you put a lot of time and energy into creating their own deck, right? And I don't want to say that like the alternatives are better. I just want to say that like I just want to make sure that you've considered typical inclusions that other people have had success with, just in case you have something where you're like, ooh, I really like that over blank, right? So hope it finds you well. And the 4th one that we'll cover this week is Orzhov Auras by Edible Ball Bearings. And I think that the fact that 3 out of 4 of the community deck techs had Sheltered by Ghosts says a lot about this card. This card is insane. And I guess actually the first one didn't have Sheltered by Ghosts, but I think you should get it in there because of how good it is, especially in best of 1. So as far as the lands go, we'll start there. So this is running 20. I think that in best of 3, I would be running this at 21. In best of 1, I would be okay with shaving down to 20 or maybe even 19, depending on how much you want to lean into your mulligan strategy of making sure your opening hand has the 2 lands. So if you bring it down to 19, you'd be losing some more games to mulligan. You have 14 untapped white sources, and you have 14 untapped black sources, and you have no double pips in white, and you have no double pips in black. So I like this. I think the lands are perfectly fine. I approve of this. Thumbs up. And the cards that are not usually included in the Orzhov Auras archetype is the Skeleton package. So you've got the Corpses of the Lost and the Case of the Stashed Skeleton and the Forsaken Miner. And I think it's aggressive, but I'm not sure it's necessary. It You also have the Spiteful Hexmage, which has a little bit more synergies with where I would be going with it, which is to lean more heavily into the enchantments. And Case of the Stash Skeleton and the Corpses of the Lost, they are enchantments. It's just that I kind of want a little bit more skeleton synergies for it to really shine, right? And that's why you typically see the Corpses of the Lost in mono black skeletons. And but I like it, right? It's innovative. And we also see the Shard Mage's Rescue, which is strangely enough not usually included in the Orzhov specific strategies. And part of that is because of leaning into the cards like the Hopeless Nightmare that have that enchantment that attack your opponent's hand. If you're attacking your opponent's hand, you don't need to have the protection from your opponent's interaction as much. So the Shard Mage's Rescue becomes less important to have. Now, most of the archetypes that I've seen are exploring black for the hand hate specifically, and leaning more into like the Bandit's Talent and the Hopeless Nightmare and picking it up with the Nurturing Pixie type thing. The other thing that, instead of the Forsaken Miner and the Corpses of the Lost, you could go with the Fear of Lost Teeth as an enchantment that helps you trigger your Optimistic Scavenger, and then also can remove your opponent's problematic like Heartfire Hero. Feather of Flight we see a lot in this archetype as a way to kind of card neutral, draw a card, trigger the enchantment, give something flying so that you get some evasion. And Victor Valgavoth's Cynical is one of the reasons, I think, to be in the black-white enchantments. So you don't necessarily want to be doing like if you trigger it a third time, you don't have the best reanimator targets, but that's okay. You're still getting a lot of really good value, and the discard, more into the Bandit's Talent, empty their hand kind of strategy that I think black-white, like why are you black-white versus green-white versus blue-white and like red-white? Red-white seems to be the winning one because Heartfire Hero just synergizes so well with the Valiant. So with black-white, you have to kind of justify like how am I beating red-white, right? And I think one of the ways is by attacking their hand. And so I'd probably lean a little bit more heavily into that and like up the Bandit's Talent, for example. And the other one too that I thought was interesting was Enduring Tenacity. And whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life, which works with the lifelink off of Sheltered by Ghosts and kind of gives you a little bit more of a top-end threat. So nothing crazy. I think most of the decks I've seen have been running 2 Enduring Tenacities, but could work with some of the life gain. So just something to consider. I think that one's probably the weaker of the 3. So thank you for your submission, and good job on the lands. And appreciate you all for being a part of my community. And I will be back to doing these when I can find time in my schedule. Again, probably in late November. So take care. And if you would like me to do this sort of thing for you, you can always join as a YouTube member. It's one of the perks. I would be happy to do these throughout the week, and not necessarily showcase you on a video, but at least give you my feedback. So it's always an option. Still no one is taking it up. So I'll at least leave it there for you if you're interested. And I will catch you all next Sunday for the Meta Breakers. Friday night, I'm shooting for the Foundation's pre-release guide for those who are excited about the new set coming on November 15th-ish, second week of November, something like that. And so interesting stuff coming down the pipeline. And take care, everybody.